On April 14th, 1988, something happened in the Persian Gulf that nobody saw coming. Not because it was secret, but because everyone was looking at the wrong thing entirely. The American military destroyed half of Iran's navy in a single day. It's the headline you know. That's Operation Praying Mantis. But here's what nobody talks about. This wasn't a victory. Not really. It was a catastrophe that exposed a fundamental weakness in how the United States projects power in contested waters. A weakness that's only gotten worse in the 36 years since, and it's the reason why Iran's navy today is more dangerous than it's ever been. The story everyone tells you starts with the USS Roberts hitting a mine. A 15-ton Corvette gets its hull blown open. Heroic sailors fight to save their ship. And they do, incredible damage control. American professionalism under fire. It's a feel-good military story. But that mine didn't just float into the Gulf by accident. It was placed there deliberately by Iran, part of a calculated strategy. And the fact that the Americans couldn't stop them from placing those mines in the first place is the real story. Here's what the narrative misses. Iran was running a denial operation, not a direct confrontation. They weren't trying to win a battle against the US Navy. They were trying to make it too expensive and too dangerous for commercial shipping to use the Gulf. They were trying to strangle Iraq's economy by choking off the oil tankers that kept Saddam's government funded. And it was working. That's the part that terrifies military strategists today. Because Iran cracked the code to asymmetric naval warfare 40 years ago. And the US still hasn't figured out how to defeat it. When the Iran-Iraq War broke out in 1980, Iraq had a problem. They needed money to fund the military. Money came from oil exports, oil that had to leave through the Gulf. But Iran controlled the eastern side of the waterway. They had the geography. They had the ability to reach out and touch anything that floated. So they started a campaign called the Tanker War. Ships moving in and out of the Gulf started getting hit. Not all of them, not even most of them. Just enough to make insurance companies nervous. Just enough to make shipping routes expensive. Just enough to make captains hesitate. The genius of Iran's strategy wasn't that they could sink every ship. They couldn't. The US Navy was there protecting traffic, escorting convoys, deterring attacks. But Iran didn't need to sink every ship. They just needed to make everyone believe that any ship could be sunk. They laid mines that didn't explode. They launched anti-ship missiles from hidden positions. They used small boats and helicopter gunships. The point wasn't to destroy American naval power. The point was to raise the cost of commerce to unsustainable levels. And it was working. Insurance premiums for Gulf transit quintupled. Shipping companies were routing tankers around Africa instead of through Suez. The global oil market was destabilizing. Iraq's economy was bleeding out. The United States watched this happen and realized they had a choice. They could accept that the Gulf was no longer a safe American lake, that regional powers could now dictate terms to global commerce. Or they could escalate. They chose escalation. They decided to neutralize Iran's naval threat through overwhelming force. That's when Operation Praying Mantis was launched. But here's the critical insight that changes everything. The operation succeeded militarily but failed strategically. The US sank Iranian frigates and destroyers. They destroyed patrol boats, killed naval personnel. They demonstrated total superiority in conventional warfare. But when the smoke cleared, the fundamental problem remained unsolved. Iran's strategy didn't depend on winning a battle against the US Navy. It depended on making the cost of protecting the Gulf higher than anyone was willing to pay indefinitely. And after Praying Mantis, the US was forced into a permanent commitment. They had to keep a carrier battle group in the Gulf. They had to establish a constant presence. They had to accept the expense and the risk forever or until Iran decided the war was over. The Iranian military understood something that American planners initially missed. In asymmetric warfare, you don't need a bigger navy. You just need to be willing to keep fighting longer than your opponent is willing to keep paying. Look at what happened next. The war between Iran and Iraq ended in 1988. The immediate threat to Gulf commerce evaporated. But the US? Military footprint in the region never left. They built bases, they established protocols, created a permanent naval infrastructure designed specifically to counter Iranian threats. Decades later, when the nuclear deal was signed and sanctions were lifted, the US still maintained that same level of presence. When the Trump administration withdrew from the deal and reimposed sanctions, the US had to ramp up even further. One operation in April 1988 set off a cascade of consequences that defined American Middle East strategy for the next 36 years. But the really counterintuitive part? Iran learned the lesson too. They watched the Americans respond to the tanker war with conventional naval superiority and realized something crucial. Building a traditional navy to match the US was pointless. They'd never win that competition, so they didn't try. Instead, they invested in the exact same asymmetric tools that had worked before: naval mines, anti-ship missiles, fast attack crafts, submarines. But they made them better. They made them deadlier. Spread them across a network of armed militias and irregular naval forces that operate in the legal grey area between military and paramilitary. The US Navy today is terrified of these boats, not because they can sink a carrier, they can't, but because they don't have to. They just have to create enough uncertainty to disrupt global shipping lanes. They just have to make insurance companies nervous again. They just have to demonstrate that America can project power, but can't guarantee safety. It's the same playbook that worked in 1988, but now it's married to a network of proxy forces, international sanctions evasion schemes, asymmetric weapons that are far more sophisticated than anything Iran had 40 years ago. The operation that was supposed to solve the problem created the conditions that made it worse. There's something almost cyclical about this. The US responded to Iranian asymmetric tactics with overwhelming force and demonstrated it works in the short term. But every time they do, they reinforce the lesson that asymmetric tactics are the only rational strategy for regional powers. Because going head-to-head with American conventional forces is suicide. But going asymmetric, staying just below the threshold of direct conflict, using denial and disruption instead of direct confrontation, that works. That frustrates American commanders. That confuses American strategists. Makes American allies nervous about the reliability of American protection. And that's worth doing, even if you lose the battle, because you're winning something larger. You're winning in the realm of strategy and perception. What's wild is that this dynamic has repeated itself over and over since 1988. The US imposes sanctions. Iran disrupts shipping lanes. The US increases military presence. Iran increases asymmetric capabilities. The US demonstrates force. Iran demonstrates resolve. Neither side escalates to full-scale conflict because both sides understand the cost would be catastrophic. But neither side backs down either. They're locked in a permanent state of tension where the status quo is expensive for everyone, but changing the status quo is even more expensive. Here's where it gets truly dangerous. Iran is now sharing these asymmetric naval tactics with other actors. The Houthis in Yemen, armed with Iranian missiles and training, have demonstrated they can threaten global shipping in the Red Sea. The network of militias in Iraq that Iran supports have the capability to launch sophisticated anti-ship weapons. The drones, the mines, the torpedoes, the fast boats with swarm tactics, all of it is being refined and distributed through a kind of informal network of Iranian proxies, allies. The whole region is becoming a testing ground for a new model of naval warfare where you don't need to match American firepower, you just need to make it too risky to operate. And the US response has been to keep doubling down on the same strategy that hasn't worked since 1988. More ships, more presence, more patrols, more technology, more money. The Pentagon's budget in the Middle East keeps growing, but the sense of security keeps shrinking. Meanwhile, Iran's military budget is a fraction of what the US spends. Their influence over the region has never been greater. That's not because they won some military victory. It's because they understood something fundamental about asymmetric warfare that American planners are still struggling to grasp. Sometimes the most effective strategy is to make your opponent's victory so expensive that they lose the political will to claim it. Operation Praying Mantis was a tactical triumph. Every metric you use to measure conventional military success, ships sunk, enemy casualties, demonstration of force, the US won decisively. But it was a strategic defeat because it proved that Iran could operate below the threshold where American military response becomes politically unsustainable. Every decade since, Iran has gotten better at operating in that grey zone. They've gotten more sophisticated. They've got more allies. They've got more tools. And most importantly, they've got 36 years of proof that their strategy works because the United States has been able to make it stop. What's truly remarkable is how invisible this story is in the official American narrative. The military history tells you about Praying Mantis as a victory, which it was, but it doesn't tell you about the strategic consequence. It doesn't tell you about how that operation locked the US into a 36-year commitment in a region that they can't leave and can't dominate. It doesn't tell you about how Iran learned that asymmetric tactics are more effective than conventional capabilities. It doesn't tell you about how that lesson is now spreading throughout the world to every regional power that has realized they can challenge American hegemony without building an aircraft carrier. They just need to make disruption more profitable than commerce. The resource that breaks this down much deeper, with declassified tactical data, satellite imagery analysis, and conversations with former officers who were actually there in the Gulf during the tanker war, is available in the description and pinned comment. Because understanding this operation requires looking at what happened after the smoke cleared, not just during the battle itself. End of part 1. Within hours of the Samuel B. Roberts striking that mine, something unprecedented was already being calculated in the Pentagon war rooms. The initial damage report from the Gulf showed that American naval superiority wasn't just being challenged. It was being systematically dismantled by an adversary with a fraction of the firepower. And the Joint Chiefs of Staff had to answer a question that would reshape naval doctrine for decades. How do you respond to an invisible enemy using weapons that cost less than a single jet fighter but can cripple a billion-dollar destroyer? The answer came swiftly. On April 18, 1988, just 4 days after the Roberts was struck, the US Navy launched Operation Praying Mantis. This wasn't a conventional strike. This was calculated obliteration, disguised as a retaliatory operation. The operation's architecture revealed something crucial about how modern militaries think when asymmetric threats emerge. Rather than simply hunting the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy and their patrol boats and frigates, American planners decided to eliminate their shore-based infrastructure, the support systems that made their guerrilla tactics sustainable. You see, a mine-laying operation doesn't work if the ship that's supposed to seed the minefield gets intercepted before it reaches the designated zone. Fuel depots need to exist, command centers need to operate, and most critically, the human operators who understand where the mines are placed need to survive long enough to use that knowledge. Operation Praying Mantis targeted all of it at once. The operation unfolded across multiple strike packages coordinated by Vice Admiral Anthony Less, commander of the Middle East Force. Attack helicopters were already hunting Iranian patrol boats in the northern Gulf. CA-18 Super Hornets were being vectored toward Iranian oil platforms that the Irgun used as forward operating bases. Destroyers and cruisers were positioning themselves to engage any surface combatant that dared to challenge them. But the real message, the statement that would echo through every naval academy and defense ministry in the Middle East for decades, was going to come from the air. Iranian frigate Sahand was detected operating in the Central Gulf that morning. Modern by regional standards, equipped with anti-ship missiles and sophisticated fire control radar, the Sahand represented Iran's most capable surface combatant. It was the kind of ship that, on paper, should have demanded respect from American planners. In a fair fight, a single frigate against overwhelming air superiority would be a mismatch. But American naval commanders understood something that most regional militaries had yet to internalize. There are no fair fights in modern warfare. There are only fights where one side has prepared better, trained harder, and integrated their capabilities more effectively. A flight of FCA-18 Hornets approached the Sahand from the east. The Iranian crew detected them on radar. They always did, and attempted to acquire targeting locks with their ship-based missile systems. But American pilots had spent years training for exactly this scenario. Electronic warfare operators in the strike package were already flooding the Iranian radar with decoys and jamming signals. The missile fire control system locked onto false targets. By the time the Iranian crew realized what was happening, the Hornets were already releasing their ordnance. Harpoon anti-ship missiles streaked toward the frigate. Sahand's defensive systems lit up in desperation. Machine gun fire raked the sky. The ship's own surface-to-air missiles fired at incoming threats. But the geometry was wrong, the speed was wrong. The overwhelming concentration of force was wrong. One missile struck the frigate's hull, then another. Fire erupted across the vessel's superstructure. The Sahand was burning now, listing its combat effectiveness erased in seconds. but the frigate didn't sink. It limped towards shallow water in Iranian territorial waters, where American ships couldn't follow without triggering an international incident. The symbolic victory was what mattered. An Iranian warship, one of their most capable vessels, had been crippled by American air power in broad daylight. The message was unmistakable. Your navy cannot compete with ours. Meanwhile, other strike packages were moving against the Iranian frigates Siri and the support ship Karg, both critical nodes in the Irgun's logistics network. The Karg was particularly important. It served as a floating command center and supply depot for Iranian Revolutionary Guard operations throughout the Gulf. Without it, coordinating mine-laying operations became exponentially more difficult. The ship was struck repeatedly. It caught fire, the crew abandoned it. By late afternoon, the Karg was a burning hulk, sinking slowly into the Gulf. The operation reached its crescendo in the late afternoon when strike aircraft located and engaged the Iranian frigate Siri. Like the Sahand, the Siri was equipped with modern anti-ship missiles and sophisticated defensive systems. And like the Sahand, stood no chance against coordinated American air power. Harpoon missiles found their targets. The ship caught fire and eventually sank in the deeper waters of the Central Gulf, making it the only Iranian frigate actually lost during the operation. But what intelligence analysts understood in the days that followed wasn't just about ships sunk or platforms destroyed. It was about what the operation revealed regarding the vulnerability of asymmetric strategies when they face an opponent willing to escalate the scope of the conflict. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy had built its doctrine on the assumption American planners would respond to mine strikes with mine-sweeping operations, anti-submarine patrols, and coastal interdiction. They assumed the conflict would remain contained within the narrow geography of the Persian Gulf, where shallow water and proximity to Iranian shores would provide protection. What they hadn't fully anticipated was that American decision-makers would use a single provocative incident, the mining of the Samuel B. Roberts, as justification to execute a comprehensive, multi-target naval operation designed to neutralize Iran's entire surface fleet and strike capability in a single day. This is the hidden lesson that transcends the historical narrative. Operation Praying Mantis wasn't just a response to provocation. It was a demonstration of how overwhelming conventional superiority can be mobilized rapidly when political authorization is granted. For every mine the Irgun could lay, the United States Navy could destroy a ship. For every patrol boat they could crew, American aircraft could eliminate a frigate. The mathematics of escalation were brutally simple. If Iran wanted to engage in asymmetric warfare, America would respond by reminding them of the asymmetric advantages that come with controlling the sea and controlling access to advanced weapon systems. The operation killed approximately 10 Iranian sailors. It resulted in the loss or severe damage to 4 Iranian vessels and 1 critical support platform. By the metrics of conventional naval warfare, it was a decisive victory. The Iranian Navy ceased offensive operations in the Persian Gulf for months afterward. Mine-laying operations halted. Patrol boat attacks dropped dramatically. American convoy traffic resumed without significant interference. Here's what the Pentagon's War College instructors didn't always emphasize when they taught Operation Praying Mantis in the years that followed. The operation didn't actually resolve the underlying strategic problem. It simply pushed it below the surface. Iranian asymmetric capabilities didn't disappear. They adapted. The Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy learned that surface ships were liabilities in a conflict with American air superiority, so they invested instead in submarines and speedboats that could operate in shallow water where aircraft couldn't effectively engage them, in missile systems that could strike from beyond visual range, in distributed networks of smaller platforms that were harder to track and eliminate simultaneously. The lesson wasn't that asymmetric tactics had been defeated. The lesson was that they needed to evolve. This is where the operation becomes truly significant for understanding modern naval competition. Within a decade, the Iranian Navy had shifted its entire operational philosophy. They began building and acquiring fast attack craft, submarines, and small missile-armed platforms. They deployed naval mines more extensively, in deeper waters, with better concealment techniques, developed unmanned systems. Simple, inexpensive drones that could relay targeting information without putting crewed vessels at risk. They learned from Praying Mantis that conventional surface ships were vulnerable in the age of advanced naval aviation, so they made themselves smaller, harder to find, and more distributed. By the time the 2000s arrived, the Iranian Navy had fundamentally transformed itself into a force optimized for coastal defense and anti-shipping operations, using unconventional platforms. The very lessons that Praying Mantis was supposed to teach, that American naval power was supreme and unchallengeable, actually accelerated the development of asymmetric strategies that would continue to challenge American interests in the Gulf for decades. This pattern has repeated itself throughout military history in ways that strategic planners consistently underestimate. When a weaker power is defeated through overwhelming application of conventional force, they rarely simply surrender. Instead, they retreat into domains where their opponent's technological and numerical advantages are less relevant, develop the capacities to strike from unexpected angles. They accept casualties they wouldn't normally sustain. They become more willing to operate through proxies, using deniable assets that can absorb losses without threatening their core military structure. The implications of Operation Praying Mantis extended far beyond the Persian Gulf. Every regional military that watched the operation, the navies of Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Egypt, Israel, Pakistan, India, dozens of others, understood that building a surface navy to compete with American carriers was economically impossible. The United States had spent the Cold War perfecting a naval architecture designed to project power across oceanic distances. Aircraft carriers, guided missile cruisers, attack submarines, and an integrated air defense system that could protect an entire battle group from threats originating hundreds of miles away. No regional power could match that investment in capability or training. But they could develop alternatives, could invest in mine-laying platforms. They could acquire submarines from Russia and China. They could develop anti-ship missiles that could strike American vessels from beyond visual range. Could train their personnel in asymmetric tactics that didn't require defeating American forces in conventional battle, but rather making the cost of American military intervention prohibitively expensive. This is the long-term strategic consequence of Praying Mantis. Accelerated the transition to asymmetric naval competition as the defining characteristic of 21st century maritime conflict. The tanker war in the Persian Gulf was never about whether Iran could defeat the United States Navy in a conventional engagement. Everyone involved understood that the outcome was impossible. The conflict was fundamentally about making the cost of commerce through the Persian Gulf so high that economic pressure would force a negotiated settlement. When the Samuel B. Roberts struck that mine, the Iranian strategy was actually succeeding. Shipping insurance rates were skyrocketing, oil prices were volatile. American naval personnel were being placed in dangerous positions without a clear strategic objective beyond protecting commerce. What Operation Praying Mantis actually did was reset the tactical situation without resolving the strategic equation. Yes, American forces could destroy Iranian ships when they chose to engage. Yes, air superiority provided overwhelming advantages in direct conflict. But that didn't change the fundamental mathematics of asymmetric warfare. If it only costs Iran a few $1 million to disrupt tens of billions of dollars in global commerce, then Iran holds the strategic advantage regardless of tactical defeats. This is the deeper reality that Operation Praying Mantis inadvertently demonstrated, even as it appeared to validate American naval supremacy. In the months that followed the operation, the tanker war gradually wound down, not because Iran had been militarily defeated, but because both sides were exhausted. The Iran-Iraq war itself was winding down. A ceasefire was negotiated. The immediate strategic rationale for attacking shipping in the Gulf evaporated. But the lessons learned by Iranian military planners remained. Understood that they could challenge American interests through asymmetric means. They understood that mines, small boats, distributed networks of assets could create strategic effects disproportionate to their conventional military capability. They understood that the very nature of American naval operations in confined waters like the Persian Gulf created vulnerability to exactly these kinds of tactics. This understanding would influence Iranian military doctrine for the next 4 decades. Dust settled on Operation Praying Mantis. American military analysts began piecing together what had actually happened in those 36 hours of combat. The official narrative celebrated a decisive American victory. The Iranian Navy had been crippled. 3 major combatants were sunk or captured. Dozens of Iranian sailors were dead. The United States had demonstrated its unquestionable dominance in the Persian Gulf. But beneath this triumphalist accounting lay a more troubling reality that senior defense officials were reluctant to discuss publicly. The tanker war had exposed profound vulnerabilities in how the American Navy operated in confined, shallow water environments. The USS Samuel B. Roberts had nearly been lost not to enemy gunfire or missiles, but to a mine that cost perhaps $10,000 to manufacture and deploy. A single diver, working under cover of darkness, nearly sunk a warship worth hundreds of millions of dollars. This asymmetry troubled Pentagon strategists far more than any surface victory ever could. Iranian military commanders, meanwhile, were drawing different conclusions from the same operation. Yes, they had suffered heavy losses. Yes, their navy had been battered. But they had proven something equally important to themselves and to their adversaries. Demonstrated that a technologically inferior force, equipped with unconventional weapons, and a willingness to accept asymmetric risk, could impose significant costs on the world's most advanced military power. A mine could do what 100 surface combatants could not. Small boats operating in swarms could overwhelm sophisticated air defense systems designed to track aircraft and missiles, not nimble speedboats. Distributed networks of assets spread across hundreds of miles of coastline could create persistent threats that no single operation could fully eliminate. This understanding would become foundational to Iranian military doctrine for the next 4 decades. While other nations modernized their navies by building larger ships and acquiring more sophisticated weapons, Iran moved in a different direction. They doubled down on the very tactics that had proven effective during the tanker war. They invested heavily in mine technology, expanded their fleet of small, fast attack craft. They developed swarm tactics that emphasized distributed coordination over centralized command and control. They built an asymmetric defense posture explicitly designed to exploit the vulnerabilities that Operation Praying Mantis had revealed. By the 1990s and 2000s, this shift in Iranian strategy had become apparent to American military planners. Intelligence reports documented the expansion of Iran's mine inventory. Satellite imagery showed the construction of new bases designed to house small attack craft. Intercepts revealed Iranian exercises that practiced exactly the kind of distributed, coordinated attacks that had nearly succeeded during Operation Praying Mantis. American military strategists began wargaming scenarios in which Iran, rather than accepting a conventional defeat, would initiate a campaign of mine-laying and small boat attacks designed to choke off all maritime traffic through the Strait of Hormuz. The implications were sobering. Nearly a third of global maritime trade passes through the Strait of Hormuz. Approximately 20% of the world's petroleum exports flow through those narrow waters. Any sustained disruption to traffic through the strait would have immediate global economic consequences. Insurance costs for shipping would skyrocket. The price of oil would spike. Global supply chains would fracture. And unlike Operation Praying Mantis, where American forces could respond with overwhelming kinetic force, a campaign of mines and distributed small boat attacks would be far more difficult to counter decisively. American military planners recognized that the Navy's traditional approach to naval warfare, which had been refined over generations of operating in open ocean, was not well suited to the Persian Gulf environment. A carrier strike group, composed of a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, multiple guided missile destroyers, and dozens of aircraft, is an extraordinarily powerful instrument for projecting force across vast distances. But in the confined waters of the Persian Gulf, where shipping lanes are narrow, where mine laying is trivial, and where adversaries can operate from protected coastal bases, these traditional advantages become liabilities. The response from the Pentagon was to develop new operational concepts tailored to the specific challenges of the Persian Gulf environment. They began experimenting with lighter, faster vessels designed to operate in shallow water, developed new tactics for mine countermeasures. They invested in unmanned systems that could detect mines and small boats without putting crews at risk. And they began establishing new command structures designed to coordinate operations across multiple services and allied nations in a unified effort to maintain freedom of navigation through the strait. But technology alone could not solve the fundamental strategic problem Operation Praying Mantis had revealed. No amount of naval power could prevent an adversary from laying mines if that adversary was willing to accept the costs. No level of air superiority could instantly detect and eliminate hundreds of small boats distributed across a vast maritime zone. The operation had demonstrated something that American strategists had not wanted to fully confront. Military superiority, even overwhelming military superiority, does not guarantee strategic success. The ability to destroy an enemy's conventional forces in battle is not the same as the ability to dictate the terms of access to strategic resources or to prevent an adversary from imposing unacceptable costs on your own interests. This lesson extended beyond the immediate tactical challenges of the Persian Gulf, reflected a broader shift in how adversaries around the world were beginning to conceptualize warfare itself. China was developing anti-ship missiles designed to make aircraft carriers obsolete. Russia was investing in swarm drone tactics that could overwhelm air defense systems. Non-state actors were acquiring advanced weaponry that had previously been the monopoly of nation-states. And Iran, having witnessed the power and the limitations of American military force firsthand, was doubling down on the very asymmetric approach that had proven effective in the tanker war. The strategic implications of Operation Praying Mantis were still unfolding decades later. The operation had not resolved the underlying tensions between the United States and Iran. It had not established American dominance in a way that deterred future Iranian challenges to American interests in the region. In fact, if anything, it accelerated Iran's commitment to developing exactly the kinds of asymmetric capabilities that had proven effective during the tanker war. By the 2010s and 2020s, Iran had become a genuine master of these tactics. Iranian naval doctrine now explicitly emphasized rapid response, distributed decision-making, and the integration of multiple types of assets into unified tactical formations. Rather than attempting to maintain a few large ships that could be easily targeted, Iran maintained hundreds of small vessels that could operate independently or as part of coordinated swarms. Rather than relying on centralized communication systems that could be jammed, Iranian forces practiced operating under autonomous command structures where individual units could make tactical decisions without waiting for orders from higher authority. This evolution in Iranian military capabilities did not go unnoticed by American military planners. Throughout the 2010s and into the 2020s, American naval forces in the Persian Gulf operated under the constant assumption that they might face Iranian attacks at any moment. Incidents where Iranian boats approached American vessels at high speed became routine. Drone encounters between American and Iranian aircraft became commonplace. The threat of mine-laying by Iranian forces remained a persistent concern. Possibility of a larger conflict, initiated by Iran through exactly the kinds of asymmetric tactics that had been refined during the tanker, war remained a genuine strategic nightmare for American military planners. The truth that Operation Praying Mantis had inadvertently demonstrated, even as it appeared to validate American naval supremacy, was more complex and more troubling than the official victory narrative suggested. Operation had shown that overwhelming conventional military power, when deployed in certain environments against certain kinds of adversaries, has inherent limits. It had shown that an inferior force could impose disproportionate costs through asymmetric means. It had shown that victory in battle does not automatically translate into strategic success or sustained dominance. For Iran, the lessons of the tanker war and Operation Praying Mantis became the intellectual foundation for decades of military development and strategic planning. For the United States, these lessons were more difficult to accept. American military doctrine had been built on the assumption of technological superiority and the ability to project overwhelming force. Operation Praying Mantis seemed to confirm these assumptions. But a deeper analysis revealed something more uncomfortable. In the confined waters of the Persian Gulf, facing an adversary willing to use asymmetric tactics, American military advantages were not as absolute as they appeared. The operation had also revealed something about the nature of asymmetric competition in the modern era. In previous centuries, military dominance had been achieved through superior ships, superior navigation, superior tactics, and superior training. A well-commanded navy could defeat an inferior opponent through the skillful application of concentrated, force. But in the age of mines, missiles, drones, and distributed networks of assets, this traditional model of naval warfare was becoming obsolete. A single mine could damage a $100 million warship. A swarm of cheap drones could overwhelm air defense systems designed by teams of engineers working for years. A distributed network of small boats could make operating in a strategic waterway prohibitively expensive. This shift had profound implications not just for American naval strategy in the Persian Gulf, for how military power would be organized and deployed globally in the 21st century. Smaller nations and non-state actors would increasingly recognize that they could not match American military capabilities in a conventional sense. But they could acquire or develop asymmetric capabilities that would make operating in certain strategic areas prohibitively expensive. They could deploy mines, drones, missiles, and other asymmetric weapons that would force American military planners to approach operations with far greater caution and at far greater cost. The tanker war and Operation Praying Mantis thus represent a historical inflection point in how military power operates in the modern world. What appeared at the time to be a straightforward victory for American naval power was actually the beginning of a long-term strategic competition that would be defined not by traditional naval battles, but by asymmetric challenges to American interests and American assumptions about how military dominance translates into strategic success. The lessons Iran extracted from that defeat in 1988 would reshape its entire military doctrine for decades to come. While American commanders celebrated a tactical victory, Iranian strategists were studying the battle differently. They noted that despite overwhelming American superiority in traditional naval firepower, they had managed to inflict serious damage on a multi-billion-dollar warship using relatively inexpensive mines and patrol boats. Asymmetry became the foundation of everything Iran would build afterward. By the early 2000s, Iran had developed the Khalij-Fars anti-ship cruise missile, a weapon system that could strike targets far beyond the range of traditional naval gunfire. They invested heavily in unmanned systems, swarm tactics, and distributed networks of small, fast attack craft that could overwhelm traditional defenses through sheer numbers rather than individual capability. Every dollar Iran spent on these capabilities was a deliberate rejection of the idea that they needed to match American firepower directly. This represents a fundamental shift in how weaker military powers think about confronting dominant ones. The traditional path to military power, building battleships, developing air forces, creating massive standing armies, became economically inaccessible to most nations. But distributed systems, denial of access capabilities, asymmetric tactics became democratized. A nation with a fraction of America's defense budget could suddenly pose serious strategic challenges. This is where the real story of Operation Praying Mantis continues to matter. Not in the headlines celebrating the sinking of Iranian frigates and the destruction of offshore platforms, but in the quiet calculations happening in Tehran's military planning rooms. Iranian commanders understood that they could never again fight America in a conventional naval engagement. The next conflict, if it came, would be fought entirely differently. Fast forward to 2019, and that strategy becomes visible. When Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps attacked the USS Boxer with a drone swarm, they weren't attempting to sink an American warship in traditional combat. They were testing American responses, demonstrating capability, showing that the rules of engagement had fundamentally changed. The drone swarm attack cost Iran perhaps a few $100,000 in materials. The resources devoted to countering it cost America tens of millions. This mathematical imbalance, where the attacker spends a tiny fraction of what the defender must spend to counter the attack, becomes the governing logic of modern asymmetric conflict. Iran didn't need to rebuild its navy to match American capability. It needed only to make American dominance sufficiently expensive and sufficiently risky that the strategic value of that dominance diminished. The consequence ripples across global maritime strategy. Today, major shipping companies factor in the cost of Iranian asymmetric threats, planning routes through the Strait of Hormuz. Insurance premiums for vessels transiting high-risk areas have surged. Some shipping routes have been abandoned entirely, adding weeks to journeys and billions to global supply chains. One nation with a fraction of American naval power has succeeded in raising the cost of American-backed regional stability. The Iranian strategy extends far beyond conventional naval competition. During the tanker war period, Iranian speedboats would dart out from concealed positions, attack merchant vessels or tankers, and retreat before American forces could respond. Primitive tactics of the 1980s evolved into a sophisticated doctrine of distributed maritime denial. Today, small Iranian vessels equipped with relatively inexpensive anti-ship missiles can threaten billion-dollar carriers. Swarms of drones can overwhelm traditional point defense systems. Submarine-launched cruise missiles add another layer of complexity. The profound asymmetry isn't just in the military hardware, it's in the strategic patience required to execute these doctrines. American forces operate under the assumption of rapid conflict resolution, overwhelming force projection, and quick victory. Iranian forces operate under the assumption of protracted competition, incremental escalation, and the willingness to absorb costs over decades. Difference in time frame and strategic patience creates its own asymmetry that military budgets alone cannot overcome. Consider what Iran has accomplished without matching American production capacity, without developing world-class manufacturing infrastructure, without the kind of technological advantages that American military-industrial complex takes for granted. They've built a credible deterrent through distributed systems, redundancy, the willingness to accept casualties, while inflicting disproportionate costs on any potential attacker. That's not just a military achievement, it's a fundamental reordering of how power functions in maritime spaces. The same pattern repeats across other asymmetric conflicts globally. The Houthis in Yemen, armed with relatively basic anti-ship missiles and drone systems derived from Iranian designs, managed to disrupt Red Sea shipping and force the world's most powerful navy to devote enormous resources to protecting commerce routes. Small maritime forces in the South China Sea have challenged Chinese dominance through similar asymmetric tactics. Palestinian resistance groups have developed tunnel systems and drone capabilities that force Israeli military planners to constantly adapt and spend billions on new defensive systems. What unifies all these conflicts is the recognition that traditional military dominance, the ability to project overwhelming force and win rapid, decisive battles, no longer translates cleanly into strategic victory. The side with fewer resources, developed technology, and smaller budgets can still impose significant costs on the dominant power simply by accepting asymmetric rules of engagement and leveraging cheaper systems to force expensive responses. If you want to understand how these asymmetric doctrines actually work in practice, the specific hardware systems, the command structures, and the tactical playbooks that smaller nations use to challenge superpowers, there's a deeper breakdown available in the description and pinned comment that covers the technical details most military analysts won't discuss openly. The strategic implication becomes clear when you look at what's happening in the Indo-Pacific right now. China is following a remarkably similar playbook to what Iran developed in the decades after Operation Praying Mantis. Building massive numbers of relatively inexpensive missile systems, developing swarm drone capabilities, investing in distributed networks of military platforms rather than a few super expensive carriers. The American response has been to spend more money on point defense systems, develop new carrier task force configurations, invest in technologies that can counter swarms. But this creates a cost spiral that no military can sustain indefinitely. Every new defensive system developed to counter asymmetric threats costs more than the offensive system it's designed to defeat. Every new rule of engagement implemented to adapt to evolving tactics requires retraining and restructuring. Every dollar devoted to counter asymmetric warfare is a dollar not spent on other military needs. The strategic math begins to favor the side that accepted asymmetry willingly rather than the side trying to maintain traditional dominance. This is what makes Operation Praying Mantis so significant when analyzed through a modern lens. The battle itself was a complete American tactical victory, but it accelerated Iran's decision to abandon conventional naval competition entirely and embrace asymmetric doctrines that have proven far more effective at advancing national strategic interests. In that sense, America's triumph in 1988 set in motion the very strategies that would challenge American interests for decades to come. The broader lesson applies far beyond the Persian Gulf or the Middle East. Every military power that relies on traditional dominance, overwhelming force, technological superiority, The ability to project power across vast distances is now facing adversaries who have studied exactly how to exploit the weaknesses in that approach. The asymmetry isn't just in hardware, it's in strategic thinking, in willingness to accept casualties, in the patience to wage slow moving campaigns, and in the ability to make dominance more expensive than the benefits it provides. The United States military still possesses unmatched capabilities in many domains, but the global environment has shifted such that military superiority no longer guarantees strategic success. Smaller power with distributed systems, cruise missiles, drone swarms, the willingness to wage asymmetric conflict can tie down vast resources and complicate strategic planning for a much larger power. It's the real legacy of the tanker war and Operation Praying Mantis, not the immediate tactical results, but the strategic lessons that reshaped how military competition functions across the entire globe. Understanding this shift isn't just about tracking military hardware or following geopolitical news cycles. It's about recognizing that the fundamental nature of how power functions in the modern world has transformed. The age of clear, decisive military victories is giving way to protracted competitions, where asymmetric forces can achieve strategic effects that were previously only possible for superpowers. That reshaping of military competition will define international relations for the next several decades. If this analysis interests you and you want to dive deeper into how modern nations are restructuring their military doctrines to compete asymmetrically with superpowers, everything we've discussed here is explored in far greater detail in the pinned comment and the channel description, including specific case studies of how different regional powers are implementing these strategies right now. Resource will give you the tactical and strategic frameworks you need to understand emerging military competitions. The story of Operation Praying Mantis is ultimately a story about how military dominance creates its own strategic vulnerabilities. By winning decisively in 1988, American forces inadvertently accelerated the development of asymmetric doctrines that would prove far more difficult to counter. Iran learned that it didn't need